The implications that quantum physics has about the way that our reality works are absolutely mind-blowing, and what's really fascinating is that many findings within quantum physics might even mirror some of the spiritual ideas that have been around for thousands and thousands of years. Now, one of the most interesting links between quantum physics and spirituality is how quantum physics seems to relate to manifestation, because there are some very intriguing correlations. However, the problem is that sometimes the physics is misrepresented. So in this video, I want to clarify some of the misconceptions so that we can properly understand how quantum physics relates to the law of attraction without making claims that just aren't true. My name's Georgia. I just finished studying a master's degree in consciousness, spirituality and transpersonal psychology, and in my free time, one of my greatest passions is researching the links between science and spirituality. Now, I am not a physicist, but when I tell you I have researched quantum physics and how it relates to manifestation intensely. So while I'm not an expert, I have been able to at least watch other videos about this topic and pick up on certain ways in which the physics is being misrepresented. Now, I think this is important to make people aware of, because misrepresenting the science not only discredits spiritual ideas, but it blocks us from exploring the deeper mysteries of both science and spirituality. So in this video, I want to clarify some of the misconceptions and give a more accurate view of how manifestation relates to quantum physics. So I guess the first question is, where do people go wrong in applying quantum physics to manifestation? The biggest misconception is this idea that quantum physics proves that human consciousness can influence reality. If you've watched videos about the links between quantum physics and the law of attraction, you've probably heard this idea that physical reality is a result of humans observing it into existence, and that quantum physics proves this idea. Now, based on the evidence within quantum physics, this is definitely a possibility, but it's certainly not proven. And this is where the misconceptions seem to stem from, because it's often presented as a proven fact. Now, where all of these ideas stem from is an experiment called the double slit experiment, and what this experiment effectively shows is that quantum particles such as electrons act differently depending or not on whether they are being measured. The key things to understand about this experiment are that quantum particles exist in a superposition of states, so they exist in multiple states at once. So an electron, for example, can be in multiple different positions at once. And what happens is that quantum particle remains in that superposition of different states until it is measured. When the particle is measured, that superposition of states collapses and the particle becomes in one definite state. So for example, an electron will be in multiple different positions at the same time until it is measured, at which point it will take on one definite state in one definite position. It will become what we essentially understand a particle to be, a single entity with a definite position in time and space. So essentially the double slit experiment shows this. It demonstrates that a quantum particle goes from being a superposition of states to being a defined single entity, a defined particle. But what's key to understand is that the only thing that this experiment definitely shows is that this transition happens depending or not on whether there is a measuring device present. So the superposition collapsing happens when the measuring device is present and is taking a measurement. So it's all about measurement here. So where does consciousness come into all this? Consciousness is relevant in one of the interpretations of this experiment. Now, this interpretation is called the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation. It's also called a consciousness collapse model, but basically this is one interpretation of what's going on in the double slit experiment, and the problems arise when people take this interpretation and represent it as a proven fact, when in reality it's just one of many interpretations of what's going on in this experiment. So anyway, taking note of that, what the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation essentially says is that consciousness is responsible for this process that's happening in the double slit experiment. This transition from being in a superposition of states to being in one discrete definite state. The von Neumann-Wigner interpretation suggests that consciousness, such as human consciousness, is responsible for that transition. Now, this could be when a human reads the measurement that has been taken on the measuring device, so when that reading kind of registers in human consciousness. But this kind of brings up loads of complicated questions that I won't go into now, but basically lots of questions arise. Exactly when would human consciousness collapse that wave function? At what point does it register in human consciousness to cause this process to happen? You know, is it when our eyes see the reading, or is it further down the process at some point where it, enters our mental processing? So if this interpretation is true, then it would mean that human consciousness is somehow able to influence quantum particles. And if we extend that further, then it might suggest that our consciousness is able to influence physical reality in general. However, one of the reasons it's important to understand that this is simply an interpretation and not proven is because there are many complexities which stem from this interpretation, which kind of get completely ignored when we just state that it's proven and really don't analyse what's going on here. Now, one of the main limitations or complexities that arises from this interpretation is that it implies that everything physical exists around us, the entire physical universe exists as a result of humans collapsing it into existence. Because, what's happening in the double slit experiment is that physical particles, are being collapsed by some process. And in this process, we're suggesting it's human consciousness that collapses them into their physical state. Now, aside from the obvious limitation that humans have not existed since the moment of the Big Bang, we have another limitation, which is that if that's true, it suggests that everything around us suddenly wouldn't exist, at least in its physical form, unless a human is observing it into existence. So, for example, there might be a tree outside somewhere that no one is currently looking at. Does that mean that that tree suddenly doesn't exist when no one's looking at it? And we're getting very philosophical here, but this is definitely an important thing to take note of and take into account if we want to claim that this interpretation is correct. It seems very anti-intuitive to assume that everything around us doesn't exist unless we or someone else is looking at it, and I think most people would probably agree that that is the case. Now, there is actually a potential answer which would help combat this limitation, which I will talk about in a minute, but I just want to briefly touch on another limitation, which is something called the quantum Zeno effect. Basically, if consciousness is required to collapse the wave function, which just means that transition from going to a superposition of states into the particle physical form. So if consciousness is required for particles to be in their physical form, then it leads to something called the quantum Zeno effect. Before measurement or observation in this specific interpretation, the quantum system exists in a superposition of different states at once. And it is measurement, or again, observation in this case, which supposedly causes that state to collapse into one definite state. Now, the quantum Zeno effect refers to the fact that if that is true, and if then a quantum system is being constantly measured or observed, then it essentially remains stuck in that state. Constant observation would prevent a quantum system from re-entering its superposition, where it can evolve and change. So theoretically, constant observation of a quantum system would mean that it would be frozen in one specific state. Now, again, this seems counterintuitive to what we experience in everyday life because things are constantly changing around us. So again, we would need some answer to this problem as well. Now, one potential solution to the first limitation, this question of whether or not things would exist without us observing them, is potentially there's some form of universal consciousness that might be responsible for collapsing the wave function of everything when we're not looking at it. Many scientists obviously won't like this answer because they'll just see it as a God in the gaps kind of argument, but if you're someone who already has spiritual beliefs and believe there is some kind of universal or cosmic consciousness, then this explanation does seem to make some sense and might be a way to address this problem within the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation. Now, in terms of the second limitation, the quantum Zeno effect, I can't combat that limitation right now because it is so beyond complicated, but I will say I have read multiple times a paper that the authors are basically creating a much more in-depth theory as to how the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation might actually work. And in that theory, they do try and combat this limitation of the quantum Zeno effect. So one day I might do a video going in depth in that paper because it's absolutely fascinating, but it is incredibly complicated, so more than I can even begin to cover right now. So anyway, the key thing to take away from the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, the idea that consciousness has an influence on quantum particles, and by extension maybe physical reality in general, is that it is one of the interpretations of the double slit experiment. It is incredibly fascinating and certainly worth studying, but it's important to note that it isn't proven. Now, the fact that the consciousness interpretation isn't proven isn't actually a bad thing. It's actually kind of exciting because it opens us up to some alternative interpretations which are equally as fascinating and which also can somehow be related to manifestation and the law of attraction. Now, the main other interpretation that I'm thinking of is the many worlds interpretation. Now, this is an incredibly crazy interpretation, but funnily enough, it's actually one of the most accepted ones within quantum physics. Essentially, what this interpretation says is that there are parallel realities in which every possibility exists. Now, I've already talked about how quantum systems exist in a superposition of states until they are measured or observed. The von Neumann-Wigner interpretation suggests that it is observation that causes that superposition to collapse into one definite state. The many worlds interpretation, on the other hand, suggests that whether it be measurement or whatever else, the act of measurement, instead of causing the superposition to collapse, instead it causes that superposition to branch into different parallel realities. So there would be a different parallel reality for each of the different states in that superposition. So it would branch off into different universes. And this is really interesting because, again, whilst it doesn't prove anything, it provides a potential scientific basis for ideas such as quantum jumping, or this idea that you can jump timelines, which I'm sure are concepts you've heard if you've watched a lot of manifestation content. If this interpretation is true, maybe manifestation is more about choosing which reality you want to experience and shifting into that reality, as opposed to creating that reality from thin air or from the quantum field. And it's probably important for me to note here that the many worlds interpretation obviously says nothing about whether or not consciousness would be able to shift you into another reality, or whether or not it's even possible to shift into one of these realities. These are all obviously additions that I'm just making on top of this, but what I'm basically trying to say is that this is another interpretation of the double slit experiment, which provides a completely different but equally as fascinating potential theoretical basis as to what might be happening in the law of attraction. So basically my point here is that it's important to not make misrepresentations like I talked about in the first place, because if we assume and present the first interpretation as facts, then we completely miss out on an alternative and equally as fascinating potential interpretation which relates to manifestation and spirituality. And honestly, misrepresenting the science doesn't do anyone any favours. It just makes all of these spiritual ideas, which maybe do have some truth to them, it makes them so easy to be discredited when we're basing them on science which just isn't correct. And these mysteries within quantum physics are absolutely fascinating, so we definitely don't lose the magic when we acknowledge that these are just interpretations of what's going on in quantum physics. And obviously some of the things I've been talking about are above those interpretations because I'm obviously adding layers to it to kind of demonstrate how it might correlate to manifestation. Anyway, if you want to understand the double slit experiment more deeply and really understand how these interpretations came out of the experiment, then I have another video where I go really in depth into it, so I'll link that here in case you want to check that out. But I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and I really hope to see you in the next video.